Hello and welcome. This is Healing Womanhood, and I'm Saffron. We've got Domino here as well. I don't know whether he's going to come up and join us. He's just wandering around on the floor at the moment. And today's video is the second part of the review of the myth of normal. Got all of these tags here to help me refer to the bits that I want to refer to. So the book is in 5 sections, and because the first section took so long to review, I'm going to review it in those 5 sections. Otherwise, it would be a ridiculously long video. So the second part of the book is all about childhood and the way that we're brought up in the world. The way that we're brought up in the world makes it sound quite parent blamey, but it's kind of the way that the world we come into is, which fits in with the myth of normal title. So chapter 8, which is where we're up to. So if you want to look back at the first part of the book, which is all about health and well-being, that video was a couple of weeks ago on the channel. You should be able to find it in the live videos. So in the second section about childhood, the chapter that we're up to is chapter 8, which is about the concept of human nature. So I've got my notes here, which is quite a big concept. And Gabor begins by talking about the reason for discussing that, which is that the relative health of any life form is a function of its essential needs being met or not being met. So to talk about our health and well-being, we need to talk about what our essential needs are, and that's our nature. So we have in our culture this assumption that humans are inherently bad. And when you look closely at various kinds of evidence of people living a more natural life in more tribal situations, and community with each other, that's not the case. So he refers to the continuum concept. Oh, I've missed a bit. So the reality is, and this I believe comes from some research, that we sort of have no nature, where our nature is so adaptable that you can't say that our nature is to be good or to be bad. Thought these tags are going to save the time that I've spent flicking through the book, but perhaps not. So I find discussions of a fixed human nature unhelpful and even misleading. I can't find where the evidence is here that we're very adaptable, but it is in there. It's definitely worth a read, this book. So yeah, he talks about the continuum concept, which is an old book by a woman called Jean Liedloff, who went to live with a tribe, I forget where, and just sort of documented their ways of being and their ways of child rearing, and it became this really kind of really well-respected parenting book. And it was never intended as a parenting book, but the way that she described the way that children were brought up in this community, here comes Domino, just meant that it became that. And so the part of that that's referred to here is survival by cooperation, that people, their nature is, and they're kind of, it's almost a way of being self-serving, is to cooperate, because it benefits the group, it benefits everybody in the group. So then he returns to why the assumption that we're bad, why the assumption that our nature is inherently bad. And there's some evidence and a quote from Darcia Narvaez that capitalism, our current capitalist system, has made us species atypical. It's so far away from what our nature is that it generates this need to compete, and that makes us unpleasant to each other. Not all of us, obviously, but that's why we can see that evidence of human nature not being such a nice thing. So on to chapter 9, which starts, it doesn't say attachment theory specifically, but to me it brought to mind attachment theory very much. And it talks about how when we're babies, we're feeling beings. And we're feeling beings before we're thinking beings. We don't have conscious, rational thought, but all of our sort of nervous system equipment for our emotional experience is there and in place, and that our cognitive equipment is sort of built on top of that. So the way that we feel shapes the way that we think. So the way that we feel very early on is kind of crucial to what our conscious experience will be as we grow and develop. And that our relationship with our caregiver forms our emotional landscape, which then eventually forms our cognitive landscape. So stressed parents lead to a shaky emotional landscape, basically. And throughout this section, in all of the chapters, he returns to this premise that we're not blaming the parents. It's not the parents' fault, because as parents, we're doing the absolute best that we can in a culture that makes it impossible to do well, just impossible, because of all of the massive stresses that are put on us to earn and survive. And we can't be there for our kids in the way that we naturally, instinctively know that we want to be, and consciously know that we want to be. So unconditional love and acceptance of kids as is, not based on behavior, leads to security. So yeah, that's fairly intuitive, that kids need to be loved unconditionally for who they are. But I think often, and it's mentioned often, love and approval and acceptance is given in a conditional way. So, oh, you've been so good eating all your dinner, or oh, didn't you do a good thing tidying up? But it's harder for parents to love kids when they're being embarrassing, making a noise in public, or just behaving naturally in ways that don't fit with the cultural norms. But it's vitally important that we're loved for who we are, not for our ability to conform. And then going to the pink marker, we talk about the work of Gordon Neufeld about children's the irreducible needs of the child. So these are kind of things to develop secure attachment and to be kind of well-functioning emotional beings. These are the needs that need to be fulfilled. So the attachment relationship, children's deep sense of contact and connection with those responsible for them. That's the first one. The second one is a sense of attachment, security and there's a bit of a paragraph about all of these, each of these. So the second one is a sense of attachment, security that allows the child to rest from the work of earning their right to be who they are and as they are. I'm changing he's to they's here. I'm going to say a word about inclusivity in a moment. And the third one is permission to feel one's emotions, especially grief, anger, sadness, pain. In other words, the safety to remain vulnerable. So those second two both speak to being able to be who you are. I think often there's a sort of disapproval of emotions among parents. Oh, stop crying and all of that. Oh, it's all right. Oh, you don't need to be upset. It's not helpful. And also, again, it's not the fault of the parents. It's cultural, and the culture frowns on kids making a noise, and the culture frowns on anyone having a feeling, doesn't it? It's very, very difficult for all of us. So for the emotions to remain accessible, the environment must allow them to be safely experienced, meaning that the child's expression of feelings cannot threaten the attachment relationship with the parents. And the last one of the four needs is the experience of free play in order to mature. So that comes down to creativity, which I think is a lifelong need as well as a child's need. So, chapter 10 is about pre-birth. And so the kind of the experience of before you're born, while your parent is pregnant with you. So this is where I'm going to say a word about inclusivity. I think that Gabor Mate does his best to do what we can with gender inclusivity, but there is, and it's to my mind still not brilliant. But there's absolutely no mention of alternative. There's a brief mention of single parents. There's no mention of alternative families of any kind. So there's no mention of same-sex parents, even just to say we don't have the evidence on how this is with same-sex parents or anything like that, which I felt really, I find it really frustrating being sort of erased from, yeah, erased from the culture in that way. I think with parenting things, it can sometimes be quite difficult, and especially when we're talking about kind of the biological experience of parenting. But I think we do need to make an effort with that. Throughout, the pregnant parent is called the mother, and it's assumed that the other parent is the father. It's frustrating. So anyway, back to the content of the book. So he does clearly clarify that we're coming from a pro-choice perspective, and any discussion of pre-birth experiences is not to be politicized or to suggest that women shouldn't have a choice. And he acknowledges the detrimental effects on the culture as a whole when women's choice is removed. And then, yeah, there's another mention of not blaming the parents for any of these experiences. And a sort of I mentioned that we as parents deserve better too. We deserve a better experience of parenting. We deserve to be able to enjoy our lives as parents, as our kids deserve to enjoy their lives as kids. Um, so pre-birth memories may not be conscious for most of us, but they live in our cells. And stress on pregnant people, which is what I'm going to say, stress on pregnant people and neglect of attention to their emotional needs, but even by the culture in general. So workplaces are particularly bad for this, but also family situations can be bad for it. Partners don't always make room for the emotional needs of a pregnant person, but also even by caregivers and doctors, just causes massive stress, which has a very detrimental effect. And then there's some statistics on the emotional and physical difficulties for the child that result from prenatal stress from the parent, and there's discussion of the stress of fathers, so the non-pregnant parent, let's say, because like why is it going to be different if the non-pregnant parent is not a man? So there's evidence that the stress of the non-pregnant parent is also has an effect, a measurable effect on physical and emotional well-being in later life, not just while the child is still in the womb. So that's chapter 10. Chapter 11 goes into birth, and I kind of just want to go set the book aside, leave it to me, because birth is something that I'm really, really passionate about, and learned a lot about kind of our birthing nature while I was having my second child. So nature has got it really by so this is a quote: by pathologizing the birth process, present day medical practice contradicts the wisdom of nature and of the human body. So there's lots of talk about how natural birth should be, which is obviously not lying flat on your back in defiance of gravity with people shoving stuff up you and shining bright lights on you, but in a more upright position in a calm and dark space. And the way that animals do it, really, they can't be pathologized into giving birth in in ways that sort of defy their own nature. There's statistics about the increased use of C-sections with no medical reason, and no benefit to parent or child. And the argument that's given as to why that might be the case is to demonstrate to women that I'm reading from my notes here, that their bodies are defective and that they must bow down to the tech, the doctors, the culture to save them. And then it says that this sets the template for parenting. So we're kind of at this vulnerable point where our bodies and our emotions are wide open. We're being given that message that our bodies and our emotions and our instincts can't be trusted, that we have to be saved, that we have to go to some expert. And this just permeates our parenting. And that we'll go back to that in the next chapter. Now, orange marker. So, in other words, birth prepares the template for the mother-infant relationship, which itself is the central locus of the child's early development. Let's talk about how obstetrical trauma, which is a thing, impacts on the parent-child relationship. So the trauma that we go through during the birthing process damages the relationship with the child. It damages bonding, it damages attachment, and it goes against our nature. And of course, damaging the bonding and attachment damages later cognitive development, because the cognitive development rests on top of the emotional development. Yeah, big fan of birthing naturally. And so there is talk in that chapter about a return to midwifery, and I think it's really important to point out there that this is American. It comes from it's Gabor is Canadian, I believe, but it comes from a perspective where midwifery is a more natural approach, and it's probably worth just pointing out that in the UK there is that kind of midwifery, but there's also a very medicalized kind of midwifery. So you might be assigned a midwife and they would be attached to maybe a GP practice or something that still pathologizes birth in a bad way. So there's a kind of nuance to the kind of midwifery that's helpful if you're in the UK. So chapter 12 is about how parenting is undermined. So even though we all have the instincts for parenting, it's part of being human, whether we have become parents or not. And even physiological incentives to do it in a gentle and loving way. So our bodies, our brain chemistry wants us to and rewards us for kind of attaching, forming attachments in the way that nature designed us to. Our unnatural culture disconnects us from our own feelings about it. So that kind of goes back to the way that we're disconnected from ourselves through the birthing process. The message of the birthing process in a medicalized culture is that you can't do this, you don't know how to do this, your body doesn't know how to do this. So after having that experience, how do you then trust your instincts that are telling you to hold your baby and all of the other things that babies need? There's also a lot of parenting books and advice from experts whose only expertise is in having parented in an equally toxic culture. It doesn't come from research or comparing different types of parenting and the outcomes of that. It's and that's one particular expert that's singled out. It's all about sort of convenience for the parents, which of course it's a very, very stressful being a parent in this world, and we do want convenience, but this world is not. It's not where we were meant to live. I mean, it is, but the way that we've made it is not where we were meant to live. So then it moves on to discipline, and there's this kind of idea that if we're not telling our kids off or even being violent with them, then they're going to grow up unruly and undisciplined. It goes into the evidence against that, and the studies that show that violent discipline just increases aggression. And that's onto the yellow marker. Increases aggression in the long term and undermines the development of self-control and responsibility. By elevating stress hormone levels, it may cause harm to healthy brain development and lead to mental health problems. So yeah, just massive evidence against sort of sort of enforced hierarchical disciplinary structure, and evidence for just gentleness and responding to children's needs. We then go on to talk about parental stress. The more stressed the adult, the more stressed the child. And we know from the last section about all of the problems that stress causes in the body. And then about how our isolation in this culture just makes it very, very difficult. Parenting is happening in these isolated little boxes where we're, 4 people just managing by ourselves. And then the difference to parenting as a community, and examples are given of places where this is still done, and how much better and easier life is for everyone. So isolated parenting is stress parenting, which is a breeding ground for personal and social malaise, is the quote. So chapter 13, I've sort of summarised it as growing up in a messed up culture. I think it is this one, forcing the brain in the wrong direction, the sabotage of childhood. So this is quite a long chapter. So, and it starts again about, well, it says, it starts with, do you ever get accused of mother blaming? Which is a question that Gabor Mate is posing to a colleague. So it talks about, although parents we're all doing our absolute best, of course we are, because we want the best for our kids. It talks about how we're doing it in a culture that just makes it impossible to do it well. So that is kind of the caveat for everything that goes on in this chapter. So it talks about kids are becoming peer oriented because there aren't, a multi-generational culture around and lots of adults around to raise them. So they're sort of raising each other. And we're not around because we got to go to work, and we're dealing with the massive financial stress and trying to feed our kids. So actually being there for their emotional development, it's we can't also manage that. A lot of us can't, some of us can. It's a sort of privilege of the wealthy, isn't it? And sometimes it doesn't even happen then. So it goes on to talk about the dangers of kids kind of raising each other. They just, no matter how nice they are, they just don't, they're not emotionally capable of raising each other. Kids need an adult-led community, and it's not available to them. So the need to survive in this peer-oriented culture, which is full of a lot of bullying, and there are some statistics on that, results in desensitization and a cutting off from emotions. It's not safe to be emotional in those kind of groups. And the loss of feelings is really dangerous. There's a really harrowing story in the book about a child dying essentially as a result of this culture kind of. I won't go into it because it's very disturbing. But the loss of the desensitization and the cutting off of difficult feelings is also the cutting off of good feelings, which leads to anxiety, depression, mental health difficulties of various kinds, which then in turn leads to physical health difficulties. Then it moves on to how marketing swoops in at this point, and takes advantage of the kind of invulnerable situation that kids are in, and products and video games, and particularly online platforms, are designed to promote addiction by the way that they generate hits of dopamine within kids' brains. So really, it's really dangerous. So there's the increase in screen time as a result of parents having to work to survive all the time. So and having to deal with stress and needing a break because of all of the stress. So, screen time has increased estimated at more than 2 hours a day in children younger than 9 years. And there are there's stuff about how much it's increased as well. And then the risks of increased screen time include language delay, poor sleep, impaired executive function and general cognition, and decreased parent-child engagement, including reading together. So this comes from a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics. I think that's what that says. And in the study conducted with preschoolers, advanced brain imaging, increased screen time associated with poorer white brain matter functioning. So yeah, there's detrimental effects of screen time. And of course, we're doing the best that we can. I think it's really, it's horrific to tell this to parents when they've almost got no choice, when there's so much else that needs doing. But it's the changes that need to happen are bigger than at a family level. And I'm kind of hoping that later in the book we're going to get to what we can do about all of this stuff. But yeah, I think it's big changes that need to happen and not things that we can do on our own necessarily. So we then move on to the way that school systems are cutting music, drama, sports, art, all of these kinds of things, and prioritizing academic subjects over creative subjects, which equates to prioritizing job readiness over emotional well-being, which I think we can all see quite clearly is a bad idea in the long term. And we've got the blue marker about the importance of play. So this is talking about the educational system in Finland, where one of the most common educational mantras is let children be children. And the work of a child is to play. Children learn best through play, and all of these sorts of things. And Finland consistently ranks at or near the top of educational test scores in the Western world and has been ranked as the most literate nation on earth. So yeah, you don't need to just jam kids' heads full of facts, but their own bodies know what to do. They need to play. So the final chapter in this section is chapter 14, and that's all about how our culture builds our character. So we're formed by our culture, and we can't be understood as individuals outside of our culture. And there's all of this focus on our uniqueness and on our individuality. And yeah, our authenticity is very, very important, and being able to be ourselves. And we are reflections of our culture, whether we're pushing against it or going with it. We can't be understood outside of our culture. And it's put much more eloquently in the book in such a way as it doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're not a person. So how we function as individuals cannot be understood outside of our relationship to the larger group. This is from Dr. Kerr, Michael Kerr. In other words, our character and personalities reflect the needs of the milieu in which we develop. And what milieu are we developing in? Consumerist capitalism and its globalized expressions worldwide. It's fundamental, and it turns out quite distorted assumptions about who and what we are show up in the bodies and minds of those living them out. So yeah, it's quite disturbing, really. It's, yeah, our culture is hurting us. I think that's the theme of the book. Our culture is hurting us. So we've got some quotes, some further quotes from this chapter. All my life, no doubt spurred by, so this is from Gabor himself. All my life, no doubt spurred by the horrors that shaped my childhood, I've wondered how it is that so many good people can be hypnotized into compliance with the indefensible. There has to be some mechanism to acculturate us to accept as normal what is inimical to ourselves and to the world we inhabit. And then further down the page, what is considered normal and natural are established not by what's good for people, but what is expected of them, which traits and attitudes serve to maintain the culture. And then we frame these as human nature and say, well, that's just the way it is. So he goes on to enumerate the traits that our culture values and says that are just the way it is. So the first one is separation from the self. We've just lost the capacity to be real and to be ourselves. We're trained very early on to separate from who we are and not to be who we are. The second character trait is consumption hunger. So buy more stuff, watch more stuff. Desires are manufactured. So this is from Bulgarian psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva. Desires are manufactured as surely as the commodities meant to fulfill them. The third character, so there's a lot more on each of these character traits, and it's worth getting the book and having a read of that. The third character trait, hypnotic passivity. So self-abandonment programmed into the social character makes us passive even in the face of threats to our existence as a species. And this is something that's really frightened me in recent years, kind of seeing people being passive in the face of things that are obviously not right, and people just going, well, that's the way it is, and believing things that are blatantly not true, and yeah, it's quite scary. So that is section 2 of the book. I'll be doing some tapping based on that. I haven't made a list of the videos that I'm going to be doing, so if there is anything that's brought up for you, I think we definitely need to do something around parenting guilt, but I don't want to focus too much on our experience as parents, because I've done previous videos, and particularly I have done around parenting guilt and processing a traumatic birth and things like that. So what I would like to focus on is our experience as children, when we were children. So if you know that you had a traumatic birth, how to process that. If you don't know anything about your birth, we can do some tapping on that as well. Yeah, difficulties that you've had as a child, not being accepted as you are, not having the community that you want. Because I think when we realize that we were meant to have these things, we can start to feel this huge grief about not having had them. So yeah, there'll be some videos coming up about that. Send me your ideas if you have them, and then we will be looking at section 3 when I have read it. I'm not going to set a deadline on that, for my own well-being and self-care, but I will see you on Tuesday for some tapping, and I'm not going to exclusively stick to tapping based on the myth and novel. In the in-between time, I'm going to do some other stuff that's relevant to our mission as of empowering ourselves as women. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. If you would like to book a free half-hour call with me, you'll find the link in the description. And if you'd like to join our women's circle, that's the same link. And I will see you on Tuesday. Have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.